EURATEX İstanbul Kongresi ve 12. İstanbul Moda Konferansımız tüm hızıyla devam ediyor. Şimdi de ticaret ve sanayi oturumuna geçiyoruz. Oturumun moderatörü, EURATEX Genel Direktörü Dirk Vantyghem'i alkışlarınızla sahneye davet ediyorum. Mr. Vantyghem ve panelistlerimiz International Apparel Federation Yönetim Kurulu Başkanı Bekke. Mr. Bekke, I would like to also invite you to the stage, please. Ve bir diğer panelistimiz, United States Fashion Industry Yönetim Kurulu Başkanı Julia Hughes. Mrs. Hughes, I would like to invite you to the stage. Ve bir diğer panelistimiz, AB Türkiye Delegasyonu Ekonomi Bölüm Başkanı Bartosz Przywara. Mr. Przywara. Ve son panelistimiz Alman Tekstil ve Moda Sanayi Konfederasyonu Brüksel Ofisi Temsilcisi Ralph Kamphöner'i alkışlarınızla sahneye davet ediyorum. Mr. Kamphöner, I would like to invite you to the stage ve sözü hemen moderatörümüz Dirk Vantyghem'e devrediyorum.
Dear Presidents, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's a great pleasure for me to be here in Istanbul and to welcome all of you to this first session of a very intensive program that we have today, a first session that will focus on trade. Our President just mentioned globalization brings challenges but also brings opportunities, and that is what we will try to discuss in the next 60 minutes, 1 hour we have. Yes, my name is Dirk Vantyghem. I'm the Director General of EURATEX. I'm the new guy in the sector. I joined the organization just 1 month ago, so I'm learning, I'm discovering the diversity, the innovation, the strengths of the sector across Europe, also here in Turkey. It's a great pleasure and a great honor for me to have accepted this post as a Director General and to be with you today. I'm the moderator, as I said, for the next hour. That means I should not speak too much, but I will encourage our panelists to speak, to share their views. Let me just, as an introduction, share one thought. As it was said before, the textiles and clothing sector is a very globalized sector with global value chains that obviously requires a global set of rules, accepted, understood, and respected by everybody. If you look at today's reality when talking about rules of free and fair competition, maybe we should be slightly concerned. Back in Europe, we have the Brexit story, which has a very important impact on our trade relationship. We all follow the trade wars that the US is having with China, but which have an impact on the European sector as well. We have irritations between trade and investment between the European Union and Turkey. I think we should acknowledge on both sides there are some frictions. So we seem to be entering in a climate of tension, of uncertainty when it comes to global trade. And I have actually, by chance, this morning's Financial Times, on the front page, there was an interesting article that measures the impact of those uncertainties on global trade. The WTO Director General announced that the forecast for global trade for the next year will be halved, will be cut by 50%. So we're going down to a 1.2% growth, half of what was forecasted before. So in short, we seem to be facing difficult times when it comes to global trade. And once again, textile and clothing is a global sector. So my basic, but I think important question towards the panelists will be to share your perspective looking at those challenges, those frictions, those, let's say, bad news that we hear left and right. How do you assess the situation? Is it so bad? Should we be worried? Should we be pessimistic? Or do you still see opportunities where the textile and clothing sector can prosper, can grow in this global uncertain environment. And the way I've asked our panelists to prepare themselves is to share their personal views and perspective towards that open, that open question. Mr. Han Bekke, who is the president of the International Apparel Federation, will try to bring a global perspective, because his mandate, so to speak, is to look at the bigger picture, at the global perspective. We will then have Julia Hughes from the US Fashion Industry Association. I've asked Julia to obviously focus on the US situation, what's happening in Washington, basically. I hope, Julia, you will bring us some answers. We have Ralf Kamphöner representing the German textile and Moda industry. I've asked Ralf to bring a European perspective, to try to speak on behalf of the European sector industry. What do you see to be the main challenges, opportunities with the new European Commission coming into place? And then finally, we have Bartosz Przywara from the EU delegation in Ankara, so representing the European Commission, responsible specifically on trade between European Union and Turkey. And of course, I've asked Bartosz to focus a little bit more specifically on the relations between Turkey and the European Union from a trade perspective. What is happening, what can be done better, what are the issues that we should focus on. I've asked each of them to be relatively short, brief, focused on their messages, a first round of presentations, and then we'll come back with further questions, interactions, also from the audience. Okay, so Han, you please go ahead.
I'll do it from here. Good morning. It's my pleasure being back here. Sorry. My relationship with TCMA goes back 30 years nearly, when my dear friend Hassan Arad brought TCMA into IEF, and we had our first international conference in this city in 1996, and it's good. Hassan I will meet tonight, my past president Umut, and my board members, Murat, who changed and gave over to Sanem Dikmen, Sunol Sangaya, and Jemal Tan, who are your representatives on the International Apparel Federation. Let me first start with a short story. In 1993, I was for the first time in Moscow with a group of Dutch manufacturers, participating in the Moda Moscow, which was organized by IGEDO. And in the evening, there was a fashion show by Escada in the Kremlin, in the ballroom, and it was amazing. My first appearance in the Kremlin. I phoned my dad, who was 85, with my first mobile phone, which was bigger than this one. We called it the fridge, it was that big. And I phoned him and I said, Dad, I'm in the Kremlin. He said, what? I said, I'm in the Kremlin, looking at a fashion show, drinking champagne from Siberia, and the vodka will be served soon. He said, the world is totally in disorder. So would he be alive in these days? He passed away 4 years later. Then he would be even more surprised and shocked. We have a trade war between China and Turkey. We have a discussion about climate change. We have a young generation coming up for that. We have tensions in the Gulf area. We have probably a financial crisis coming up. We have a growing population in 2050, especially in countries like Africa. How do we feed them? How do we dress them? There are a lot of economic, political, and financial turmoil in the world. But still, there is economic growth. The IMF is predicting a growth for next year of 3.5%. And that is mainly coming from emerging markets like India. Especially India is doing best with a growth of some 7%. So it's not that bad as it might be. But in the emerging markets like Europe and the US, the average economic growth will be less than 2%. And those are your important export markets. The positive fiscal measures President Trump has taken are expected to lose momentum given a forecast of 1.9% growth in the US in 2020. It's not for nothing that by Twitter again, Trump is urging the Fed to lower its interest rate to stimulate consumption. Turkey is dominating the IMF figures of the emerging Europe bloc, and the expectation is your economy will pick up with a growth of some 2.3% next year. It's not much, but it is still growth. Part of the weakening economic outlook for important export markets is caused by a sharpened geopolitical power play. The USA and China, as I said, are fighting for economic and political dominance, where other countries fear to be the ball instead of the player. Keep in mind that the economic institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO were initiated by the USA, the so-called Bretton Woods rules. They limit the political influence on trade. Now, this system of international treaty rules is rapidly being replaced by an approach in which power play and power-based deals prevail. There is a growing uncertainty about the costs of trade due to the Trump tariffs on imports from China, and uncertainty about the outcome of another drama, which is Brexit. There is a deeper ground, in my view, for these tensions, which is populism, that could easily end up in protectionism. Well, it is already leading to protectionism. On the other hand, if China loses ground in the US, it could open the market for other suppliers like Turkey. But at the same time, China could move its exports to Europe, also an important market for them, where competition is already very fierce and could be even more strong. The effect of these uncertainties, in my view, let alone the tariffs, spreads as an oil stain through the entire apparel and textile industry. It even, in my view, can have a negative influence on investments in sustainability. The apparel and textile industry are already suffering damage from these Trump tariffs. And just by the uncertainty, the tariffs and the threat of further tariffs on China, the industry has become less stable. So that's the landscape in which you have to operate. And where buyers have to make a decision where to source. And this uncertainty, combined with less economic growth, might even lead to new sourcing opportunities. And it is not good news probably for many manufacturers. Uncertainty is the new normal. Talking about the Brexit, it will affect, if there is a hard Brexit, nobody knows what will happen. So far, Mr. Johnson has not come up with a plan, but he is supposed to come up the coming days. I saw on Sky News yesterday evening in my hotel room. So far, the EU stands firm not to change the treaty that was, the agreement that was signed with Theresa May. But it will, if there is a hard Brexit, it will hit European countries. And from the countries outside the EU, it will hit Turkey most. That's the expectation. But we do not know in this gambling situation what, well, you could gamble about it, but nobody knows about what the outcome will be. Talking about the trade landscape for industry, I foresee that the influence of sustainability on trade policy and on buying practices will grow against the background of a broader climate change discussion. The image of our industry is not good. We are seeing textiles and apparel as one of the most polluting industries in the world, if not the most polluting, after gas and oil. Whether that is true, whether we like it, the framing is there in the public opinion and on political level. In a growing number of countries, associations, brands, manufacturers, also here in Turkey, are working on initiatives to make our industry more sustainable. In my view, we have too many initiatives. The Copenhagen Fashion Agenda, the G7 Fashion Pact, the Textile Bündnis in Germany, the Konferansı for Sustainable Textiles and Clothing in the Netherlands, etc., etc. Too many initiatives. Better Together should also work for bringing together, and IEF is working on to bring all these initiatives together because a lot of costs are involved and it doesn't bring us any further. In France, there is a legislation on due diligence for bigger companies. Well, I'm well informed Germany is thinking about that. On EU level, some countries like the Netherlands are working on an extended producer's responsibility to bring down the million kilos of textiles that end up in landfill. The interest in circularity projects is growing. Trade rules should take into account growth of recycling, in my view. It's expected that European Parliament will call more empathically for environmental and social requirements like human rights and child labor to be implemented in FTAs and GSP. And it was already mentioned by Mr. Pacanelli, the Green Deal of the new Commission will have effect also on policy making and responsibility for our industry. In my view, trade policy should not be used too much by other political fields, but it is a reality that we have to cope with. You, as entrepreneurs, in my view, have to be careful not to be squeezed between these political, economic, and sustainability developments. There are challenges ahead of us, but also opportunities. The growing attention for where and how we make our products could lead to reshoring or nearshoring. We see already a movement back from the Far East to Europe, and I think that Turkey can play, and is already playing, a dominant role in that. Portugal is building up new capacity for textiles and clothing. I'm probably the only one in the Netherlands who think that production will come back. I say that for many, many years. They think that I'm an idiot, but I see the first companies trying to build up a production. And I guess with the new techniques we have, it can be done. And I'm convinced. And if you look at the development in the retail, where old structures are disappearing because of the influence of internet, then I strongly believe that there is a need for reshoring and nearshoring. It can only be fixed in a good cooperation in the supply chain between textiles and clothing. I'm finalizing. Speed to market is key, and digitization gives us new tools to perform better, as we could see in the wonderful film at the beginning of this conference. The future is not as bad as it might look, because you're entrepreneurs. You have to be positive to work on it, but see the challenges and not the dangers. Thank you.
Thank you, Han, for, let's say, taking us through, indeed, a fairly long list of challenges, but I appreciate your last words to say challenges should be turned into opportunities. Thanks for that. Julia, as I said, we're looking forward to listen, to understand, trying to understand what happens in Washington. Please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I love Istanbul. The weather is beautiful. The view is beautiful. And it gets me out of Washington, D.C. for a few days, which is not a bad thing. But I'm happy to share a U.S. perspective on what's happening in trade policy and what the impact is on fashion brands, retailers, and manufacturers. The first thing I have to say is that, at least in Washington, we all know this is not normal. This is not how we are used to doing business. International agreements, as Hans said, international agreements, international institutions are not functioning as they used to. Institutions in Washington are not functioning as they used to. And we continue to have a debate in Washington over whether the current trade policy is a negotiating tactic or is it actually the policy? So I can't answer all those questions, but I'd like to share some views on behalf of our members, USFIA members, our outlook for fashion companies, and a few words about the future of the US and Turkey relationship in our sector. So when I left Washington, of course, most of the attention is on the political situation. I'm not going to talk about that right now, but if you have questions, we can talk about that in the Q&A. But trade policy is still a really important part of the news in Washington. Last week, the US and Japan signed a trade deal, a very modest deal, mainly focused on US agricultural exports, and some digital trade agreement, but most of the agreement is basically what was in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that we had negotiated under the previous administration. So while modest, though, for many in the trade community in Washington, it's viewed as a very positive step because it seems a bit more like traditional US trade policy. We're negotiating deals, even though they're bilateral. So it's a refreshing change from just talking about trade wars and higher tariffs. But let's be honest, most of the energy in Washington, and I'm sure what most of you are concerned about, is the ongoing US-China trade war. The Trump administration, senior officials, they're pleased with how the war is going. If you look at the statistics, overall imports from China have fallen. Not in our sector, but overall imports have fallen. If you look at the duty collections, more money has been collected than ever before. So as of mid-September, the latest data that was publicly available, Trump trade policy measures have led to the collection of $38 billion in extra tariffs. $38 billion. Some of that on steel, some of that on aluminum, some of that on Turkish products, some on solar panels, some on washing machines, but most of it, $29 billion on US imports from China. Now, we know that the US leader thinks that it's the foreign country that pays those tariffs, but I think all of you know, as with other tariffs, it's those of us in the private sector, the importers, who are paying the tariffs. In the discussions thus far, textiles, apparel, footwear, home textiles have not been a very important focus of the discussions. That's part of why the tariffs were imposed on our products toward the end, because consumer products are recognized as already having high tariffs, as you know, but also that the gain is not going to be an increase in US manufacturing or keeping jobs open in the US in our sector. So what's the outlook for US fashion companies? Now we're paying tariffs, 15% on about 90% of our imports from China on apparel. We've already been paying tariffs now at 25% on travel goods, some textile products, headwear, some other consumer products as well. So I want to just say a few words in my time about what our members are thinking. So each year we do a benchmarking survey. And in our survey, we ask our member companies what are their top concerns. Since Donald Trump was elected president, for those two surveys, obviously the top concern was protectionism and what's going to happen in trade policy. But this year, in 2019, we got a different response. This year, the top concern is rising costs. So increasing production and sourcing costs are the biggest worry. And in many ways, this is obvious because part of the reason those costs are higher is because of protectionism in the trade war. So we've moved on, we're dealing with protectionism, but we're seeing the rising costs. But what we found as we analyzed the data that was even more troubling is that, of course, costs are going up from China, but we're also seeing costs up higher from Vietnam, from Bangladesh, from the countries where US buyers have moved their sourcing. Those costs are rising faster than from China, because in China, they're trying to mitigate the impact. There are other reasons why companies are concerned with higher costs. While many economic indicators in the US are strong, we also see some weakening. Just yesterday, weaker manufacturing numbers. For our sector, we're also looking at a really key indicator, the data on store closings, which is of great concern to us. More retail stores have closed in the US in 2019, in the first 7 months, than during all of 2018. And that's not counting the stores that we're continuing to see to close and the bankruptcy filings. Look at Forever 21 filing for bankruptcy this past weekend. We know also that when those bankruptcies happen, it's a problem in the US, it's a problem for employment, it's also a problem for you and for suppliers around the world, because often suppliers are left holding some of the difficulties in payment and not getting your payment when you should. So we're seeing less optimism and more uncertainty, more disruption than ever before. So where does that lead us? You know, I want to kind of wrap up with a few words that are more positive, because all this disruption, what's happening all around the world, there actually is an opportunity, I think, for closer ties between the US industry and Turkish industry. In a way, it's a reintroduction of the Turkish industry to the US buyers and suppliers. Somebody's going to benefit. We've seen benefits already in Asia, but I think that's going to move beyond Asia as we're seeing lack of capacity in many manufacturers. So today, I looked at the data. If we were doing PowerPoints, I'd have a beautiful slide of this. We'd look at the data for imports from Turkey, and imports are up from Turkey. And Turkey is a very strong supplier of yarns, I think the 7th supplier of yarns, the 9th supplier of fabrics, the 7th supplier for home textiles and made-ups. But Turkey lags on apparel. Turkey's only our 21st largest supplier on apparel, and less than 1% of apparel imports come from Turkey. So I think there's a terrific opportunity there. And why do I think that? Because if I go back to our benchmarking survey, what is it that US sourcing executives are looking for when they are sourcing? And we have 4 criteria that our members are focused on. First, speed to market. Second, sourcing cost. Third, flexibility and agility. One of those indefinable things that you know it when you see it. And risk of compliance, meaning low risk of compliance, whether it's social compliance, environmental compliance, quality. And I think when we look at Turkey, the perception has been that it's a cost issue, but I don't think that is the case anymore as we look at the prices that are going up around the rest of the world to the US market. And we know that we have the design, the manufacturing, the vertical integration to meet the other criteria that our members are looking for. So I think that we're really at the start for Turkey-US relations at a very positive place. The trade wars are still out here. I'd like to hope that they will be resolved soon. I think the US economy would do better if they are, but right now there are no guarantees of that, so we're moving ahead assuming we will continue with the tariffs on China. So let me just wrap up. I love your slogan, Better Together. I think that that fits very well how our sector likes to work, how brands, retailers like to work with suppliers and like to create relationships and partnerships for the long term. And also, it fits well with our motto at USFIA, which is fashion made possible by global trade, which is really why we're all here. So thank you so much for the chance to be here, and I look forward to the question and answer period. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Julia, for, again, bringing a kind of an optimistic message towards the many Turkish colleagues here in the room. Thank you. Let's move from Washington to Brussels. Ralph, please, you have the floor.
Yeah, Dirk, thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. I would like to thank, in particular, also the organizers of this very nice and successful conference here. It's a pleasure to be again here in Istanbul. I'm here to speak about a European perspective. I'm also representing the German textile and fashion industry. That's a sector that I often call a high-tech sector because it's composed of 60% technical textiles and the rest is fashion at home textiles. It's very much future-orientated. We count 1,400 companies that create 135,000 jobs in Germany, so it's a strong employer and it's a quite competitive sector. What is our perspective on what is happening now in EU trade policy? What is the European Union doing? I think it's fair to say that this year, ladies and gentlemen, is a year of transition. You switch on your television and you go to the internet. You see that the European Parliament is currently taking under scrutiny the new candidates for the post of commissioners. European Parliament itself has just been elected in spring, at the end of May. And the orientations, of course, that are emerging on trade policy are also undergoing some change. When you look, for instance, at those members of the European Parliament that work more closely on international trade in the so-called Inter Committee, you have, I think it's fair to say, less people who focus on the competitiveness of the industry, and I have more and more people who emphasize non-trade concerns, and this has an impact on our sector. This has an impact also on the trade agreements that will be negotiated, that are being negotiated, and those that have been negotiated and now need to be ratified. I'm talking here about Mercosur, I'm talking about Vietnam, and it's far from sure that this will be a smooth process, and we have to expect some very harsh and tough discussions there in the European Parliament. And then, on Monday evening, some of you may have followed it, I couldn't because I was traveling, there was the new Trade Commissioner designate, Phil Hogan, interviewed during 3 hours in the European Parliament. Now, I was told that this hearing was a quite positive hearing. So probably, if everything goes well, on the 1st of November, you will have a new Trade Commissioner. And this gentleman is actually already member of the European Commission, but he is responsible for agriculture. He is, in that position, closely involved in everything the European Union does in terms of trade negotiations. He knows trade policy quite well, but of course, in particular the agricultural part of it. We will see how much affinity he will develop to the textiles industry, but I think overall we can say that trade policy is in good hands. And also in the hands of somebody who understands the perspective of the industry, of the economy. So that makes me slightly optimistic. Now, what do we expect Phil Hogan to deliver in the coming 5 years? Of course, we always talk about open markets and fluid procedures. If you take a shirt that is put on the market, we have a video on our website that shows that 140 countries are involved in the production of such a shirt. You could take examples from other product areas. This is something that illustrates that we need to dismantle borders and that we need to make sure that trade is open, procedures flow, they are fluid, and that, of course, is closely related with the question of Brexit. It's not for chance that they took an Irish commissioner. It's very interesting to see. And yeah, this is one thing that we expect, and free trade is best secured by the rules-based multilateral trading system. My colleagues were alluding before to the World Trade Organization, which is now going through, may I say crisis, but at least I can say through difficult times. We see that the dispute settlement mechanism of the World Trade Organization is far from operational. There are reasons for that, and the EU is trying to find alternative arrangements to ensure the enforcement of trade deals. We need to monitor that very closely, and it's very important for us that the multilateral dimension can be strengthened again. And the WTO needs to work in a perspective also. There are so many things that are new in the economy and that require a trade policy answer. There are plurilateral discussions on electronic commerce now ongoing, but we need discussions probably also on rules of origin. We will be in Geneva as Textile and Moda at the public forum of the WTO on the 10th of October, and we will be talking about that. Bilateral trade policy. There's, as I mentioned before, a lot of bilateral initiatives going on, and this is something that we support very strongly. We support also very strongly the new EU-Turkey customs union. It's a priority for us. There's a big issue in Europe on trade policy and how it relates to sustainability, also in the new European Parliament. There are some people who say it's important to cater for those concerns, to address them properly, and to give a trade policy answer. We say this is a good idea, and sustainability is a value in itself and needs to be taken seriously, but it does not mean that you can put it in whatsoever relation with trade policy. There are things that trade policy can helpfully do, and there are things trade policy shouldn't do. You can put it in those words, maybe you can say there is a positive discrimination, for instance, encouraging sustainable imports under regimes like the generalized system of preferences from certain countries, or you can impose trade restrictions. I think the incentive solution has often proven to be the more successful one. So this is a major construction site for the new European Parliament, and we need to be very careful that sustainability is not used as a pretext for vested interests, because there are examples of that having happened in the past, and we need to be careful that this will not take place in the future. Closely related is the discussion that is right now starting in Brussels on the new generalized system of preferences. And that's a process that we are following very closely, and there you have exactly the same sort of debate and discussion. And when I say preferences, then of course we need to talk about rules of origin. Rules of origin, it's, should I say that in a conference like this, it's a nightmare in particular for small companies, because it's very difficult to administer them. Of course, this is something that we will not be able to solve in the nearer future, but still it's something that needs to be addressed. If you take, for instance, the discussion on the pan-Euromed cumulation, the PEM cumulation, it was back in 2011 that EURATEX established its position on that, on which basis the Commission is now negotiating, and we are almost there. We are almost at the point where we can harvest the fruits of the negotiations. The compromise proposal which is on the table is certainly not perfect, but I invite you to make up your minds whether it wouldn't be a good idea to say, okay, let's reasonably consider what's on the table, compromise, and see if that wouldn't help us if we could harvest those fruits rather sooner than later. Voila, there's a lot of things to do also in the area of trade facilitation, customs, but I think we have been given 7 or 8 minutes. I've not counted them now, but I think I've almost exhausted them. So thank you very much. My conclusion is better together, and I would add from our point of view, let's have open markets, fluid procedures. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Ralph, for, let's say, summarizing the Brussels agenda on trade policy. As you said, we are in a transition period. We have new leaders in Brussels that are coming on stage, and certainly as EURATEX, we will very closely monitor the different dossiers that you have mentioned and make sure that the European textile and clothing sector is properly represented, heard, respected by those negotiators. Thank you, Ralph. We conclude our first round with Bartosz from the EU delegation, as I said, focusing specifically on relations between European Union and Turkey. Bartosz, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting the European Union delegation here to Istanbul, to this conference. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be in Istanbul. It's a pleasure to be in this beautiful palace. Yeah, to paraphrase our American colleague, I'm very grateful that this conference allowed me to escape for one day from Ankara. So yeah, it's very good to see that there is big cooperation between European and Turkish industry, which is encompassed by the title of this conference, Better Together. We are trying to do it at the official level to promote the cooperation between the European level and Turkey, but I see that it also goes without our help. So to move to the textile sector, textile sector is definitely one of the most important sectors here in Turkey, and well, also in in the European Union, although definitely the share of importance is a little bit different. But the work in this sector definitely contributes to the strong trade and economic relationships between the two sides. The European Union is by far the largest market for Turkish textiles and apparel. In 2018, Turkey was the second largest supplier of EU market in textiles, third largest suppliers in clothing. At the same time, Turkey is also the second largest customer of the European Union textiles. So the relationship is really very strong. Many European brands use the Turkish suppliers in their production chains, of course, where we are in the stage of globalization, obviously. And Turkey is also increasingly creating its international brands, its international position abroad, including in the European Union. So textiles, a little bit like automotive sector, are one of the big success stories of the customs union that we have already for quite a long time between the EU and Turkey. And we need to keep in mind that despite all the ups and downs in political relations, the economic and the trade relations between the EU and Turkey are going very, very well. They have remained strong, they have remained, let's say, blossoming, and it's mainly thanks to this special relationship which has been laid by the customs union. So thanks to the customs union, Turkey is a sort of extended part of the European Union internal market, and also in many areas it is the backyard of the European competitiveness. As I said, there are connections between European business and Turkish businesses. Our bilateral trade volume keeps increasing. In last year, it has reached 153 billion euros, despite, in fact, slow economic growth in Turkey, despite the slowdown in Europe. Turkey has done particularly well last year because it has increased its exports of goods to the EU by 9% to over 76 billion euros, and it reached practically an even trade balance, which is a historical event. So far, the European Union always has a surplus. Last year, it has almost reached the even balance. Well, the EU is a secure, large, stable market, so of course no wonder that over 50% of Turkey's goods exported abroad go to the EU. And also Turkey continues to be the fifth largest trade partner of the EU, which is also an important position, important success. The same trend is observed also in this year, 2019. Turkish exports has grown to almost 40 billion euros only in the first half. And in fact, there is a trade surplus for Turkey of almost 4 billion euros. So again, the story continues. This very deep trade and economic relation has been, of course, helped by the enabling role of the customs union, as I said. Before going into the subject of customs union modernization, which I'm sure that everybody is very much excited about, let me just remind that before we start talking about the modernization, we should first correctly implement what we have now on the table. What is the current existing customs union? Of course, Turkey is closely integrated in the value chains, serves as a major production hub for the European companies. However, we are receiving from the European companies more and more an increasing number of complaints about several trade barriers that prevent European companies from operating freely here in the Turkish market. We have practically every week, every month, new complaints, but let me just enumerate a couple of them which affect especially your textile industry. These are the additional customs duties which are imposed on the third countries' imports. These are the requests for the certificate of origin, which in fact shouldn't exist inside the customs union. This is the import surveillance. This is the excessive testing and certification requirements. All those, of course, seriously affect operations of the European companies here in Turkey, and also the international distribution channels. So yeah, while we are planning the modernization of the customs union, we should make sure, we should work to improve the functioning of the existing customs union. Definitely, there is no doubt that the modernized extended customs union would be a win-win situation for both sides, both for Europe and for Turkey. I'm sure that you are aware of the fact that the European Commission in December 2016 submitted a recommendation to the Council, so to the member states, 28 member states of the European Union, asking for a mandate to start negotiations of the modernization of the customs union. This mandate is still yet to be given, so we haven't received a positive answer from the member states. Moreover, in June last year, the Council stated that, here I'm quoting, Turkey's accession negotiations have effectively come to a standstill and no further chapters can be considered for opening or closing, and no further work towards the modernization of the EU customs union is currently foreseen. So this is the political decision. Unfortunately, it is still valid. Of course, it can be changed in the future, but for the moment it stands as it is. Well, the member states, well, in one word, member states ask or request or wait for the political progress here from Turkey, from Turkish leadership. But at the same time, nevertheless, the normal everyday cooperation continues between the EU and Turkey, of course, mainly on trade and economic matters. We have, over the last years, we have engaged in regular meetings, both at the technical and the high level. This year in February we held a high-level economic dialogue, which was organized here, quite close, in the next palace, with very active participation from the association, from the European and Turkish business associations, and with the participation of Minister Albayrak and Commissioner Katainen. So that was a sort of best example of our dialogue. We have regular dialogue on economic reform process, whereby the European Commission and European member states, together with the Turkish authorities, agree on the structural reforms to be pursued here in Turkey on the way to the accession to the European Union as a way of preparation for, let's say, facing the competitive challenges of being a European Union member state. We have several subcommittees now this month, and of course, needless to say, we have also a very active dialogue on the customs union in so-called EU-Turkey Customs Union Joint Committee, where we meet, where we discuss, and we try to solve the bilateral problems, not bilateral, between the EU and Turkey. We try to solve the trade issues. So our engagement with Turkey definitely continues. It hasn't stopped at all, mainly on economic and trade matters. Of course, this cooperation is of great interest for the European and Turkish business community. I see, once again, it's very good that I see also this cooperation from the bottom up. So the businesses, despite all the all the issues at the political level, continue dialogue, continue talking and exchanging views and cooperating. And yeah, I'm very happy that this cooperation is kept alive. So thank you very much, and well, I wish you a very good and very successful conference here. Thank you.
Thank you, Bartosz, for let's say updating us on the EU-Turkey massive economic partnership. If you look at the numbers, the importance, as you said, in both directions, it is such an intense cooperation. Yes, there are some small frictions, or not so small, there are some frictions. At the same time, I'm convinced, and I speak for, I think, the industry, we all want to go forward, and we all want to intensify, smoothen trade and economic relations between European Union and Turkey. And if we can contribute, as in my previous life I have tried to contribute, as you know, we will certainly do that. Very good. That was a tour of the world, so to speak. We have this screen here with a big clock. You cannot see it, but it says 11 minutes and 13 seconds left for this session. I don't know if we can do that technically, but I would like to give the opportunity to you, the audience, to raise any quick, focused questions or comments on what has been said. I mean, we can continue to talk, but let's try to make it a little bit interactive. So I don't know if we have microphones available. So is there anyone in the room that would like to react or comment on what has been said by any of the speakers? Can I ask you to be short? I said I have this big clock, 10 minutes. So please, let's allow for a few quick reactions, English or Turkish, and introduce yourself with your quick comment, please.
Hi, I'm Sami, member of board of the association. I have a technical question, actually. The question is, if there is a Brexit happening, and can the UK sign an agreement separately from the European Union with Turkey?
Bartosz, probably?
In the case of Brexit,
yes.
right?
Well, the Brexit hasn't happened. The UK is still member of the EU, and we don't know what will happen. Whether it will be a Brexit with a deal, without a deal, whether there will be a Brexit at all. So it's really difficult to speculate at this time. We don't know what will be our relations with the UK after it happens, if it happens. So,
but technically.
Well, technically, Turkey is obliged by the customs union with the European Union to follow its trade policy. Therefore, if theoretically the European Union starts negotiating with independent UK some kind of trade deal, then Turkey will probably do the same. But it's pure theory for the moment.
Okay. Who else? Lady at the back. Again, quick introduction and a focused question or comment, please.
Hi, I'm Hülya Güler from Hürriyet Daily. It's a newspaper here for the foreign guests. I'm explaining it. My question is about the business opportunities for Turkey in terms of trade wars between USA and China. If Miss Julia could answer that question, I'll be delighted. Last time, the trade minister of USA was here, and during his visit here, there was some discussions about this new situation, post-trade wars era, will give an opportunity for textile and apparel sector of Turkey around 5 billion export to USA. Do you find this opportunity realistic? And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that matter in general. Thank you.
Julia.
I would like to think that it could be realistic. The problem is that the way process works in the US, it would take a very long time to move to some type of a special trade agreement or free trade agreement. And up until this point, the Trump administration has not notified Congress that they're interested to have talks with Turkey. First step is to notify Congress before there can actually be serious substantive negotiations. They've notified that they had talks with Japan. We have our small deal with Japan. They've notified talks with the UK. Well, we don't officially have those talks yet until after Brexit. but we're waiting. In theory, yes, Turkey could be notified, but given the political situation as we're heading into the election year and the I word that is being discussed in Washington, I'm skeptical something will happen in a timely manner.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else that wants to raise, please, the lady there. The mic is coming.
Hi, my name is Ziba Dalili. I'm from Los Angeles, but it's been 2 years I moved to Istanbul. We were manufacturing in Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles for a long time. But as you know, a lot of production stopped early 2000 in US. So my question is for all, parties in Europe, Turkey, and in US, Miss Julia especially, that now that I want to do manufacturing here and I want to be a small business branch of US here, do I have any support? Because every speech is for bigger companies. As we know, I remember when Forever 21 started to grow and become Forever 21, and now they bankrupt. So for the birth, for growth, and for death, we have new companies to come up to fill up the gaps that we have in the, our society. What support I have here as U.S. member in Istanbul? I want to enter to Europe. I don't want to do manufacturing in Asia. I want to do in Turkey, and I need support from you. Thank you.
Can we give support? Or
Well,
but I would like to just emphasize what you mentioned, the setting up of the small business that you said. That it's I haven't heard the SME word very often in the presentations. Maybe Ralph, sorry.
Yeah.
It's something certainly as EURATEX we would like to emphasize the crucial role that SMEs should play and the support, political support, financial support, but the support that we should all try to give towards SME development, certainly in Europe and also here in Turkey. But let's have a Han and then also. Han.
You hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Small is beautiful, I would say. I hope you're a member of TCMA because the national associations should help you, as all the associations try to help, especially the SMEs.
Yeah.
But what I said is I believe that you, as Turkish manufacturers, have a perfect position between what is happening in the East. I said the growth will be in the East, so you have to look at the markets there. India is a very important market for the future. When the government is building down the non-tariff barriers and the import duties, etc. But it is an important market towards very young people, etc. So, but on the other hand, you deliver a lot to Europe and the USA. The association can give you the information about what is happening in those countries, and you have to react on that. Cooperation also. But I see, especially for small companies, SMEs, I see opportunity to be closer to the market instead of going into the danger of big markets where a lot is happening. Like in the US, nobody knows what the Democrats will be, whether there will be a Democratic president. Hope to hear from you where they stand. Normally they are protective, very protective.
Yes.
So where do they stand in this whole trade discussion? So support. Go to your association, I would say. And of course, I'm saying that because I'm an association manager.
Thanks. Julia, quick.
Yes, associations are important. If you have a presence, though, in Los Angeles, there can be some help for SMEs by the U.S. government, the Commerce Department service, and they have somebody on the West Coast. If you talk to me later, we can exchange details, and I'm happy to share that contact info for you. I mean, they're not that helpful to create new markets, but in terms of information and what might be some opportunities and support for smaller companies, there is some government support.
Okay, good, thanks. And let's continue the talks afterwards. Let's take one final question because we have 2 minutes left. So please, Isabel. The mic is coming.
Thank you. Isabelle Veller from EURATEX, Director for Trade and Industry. Thank you very much to you all for this very interesting panel and presentations. We have talked a lot about the trade irritants between EU and Turkey, and I have a question for you, and maybe for you, Bartosz. What would be your recommendation to all the Turkish manufacturer representative here on how to address these trade irritants with their government and with the European Commission and national governments in Europe, member states as well?
Bartosz.
Well, I'm not sure this is a question for the national governments in Europe. The trade irritants are mainly from the side of the Turkish authorities. What the Turkish industry can do? Well, talk to the government, talk to the ministry, and somehow try to make those barriers cancelled. This is what we are trying to do. This is also, of course, what is our big role in here in Turkey. Our meaning the EU delegation, because we have the responsibility for running the trade policy. It's a communitary competence. It's not responsibility of the member states. It's the responsibility of the European Commission. So definitely we are in constant contact with the Ministry of Trade, with the authorities here in Turkey. We are gathering the information from the European business, well, from Turkish business as well. We are gathering. We are trying to see what are the most important and most hurting issues, and trying to pass this message to the authorities. So definitely we would be very, very grateful for any help also from the side of Turkish businesses to solve those issues. Well, good. That's it.
Thank you, Bartosz. Okay, good. Ladies and gentlemen, this clock now says 000, so we are at the end of this first panel. I want, of course, to thank our panelists, and I want a final message from EURATEX, our Brussels, let's say, head office. Trade is one of the top priorities for the organization. It's clear. I think we heard the range of challenges. We all know what's happening around the world, so to speak. But I think many of you emphasize that these challenges can be looked as an opportunity as well. And it's our job, at least we will try, as EURATEX, with our membership, to turn those challenges into opportunities so that European, including Turkish companies in the textile and clothing sector, can benefit from the opportunities offered by globalization. That is something that we have worked on and continue to work on in the years to come. So once again, thanks everybody, thanks to the panelists for being with us. Thanks for your attention. I hope it was interesting, and I close this first session.
Mr. Vantyghem, we thank for your speech and also for the panelists. And now we have a gift ceremony. Değerli konuklarımız, hediye takdimi için Türkiye Giyim Sanayicileri Derneği Yönetim Kurulu üyesi Sayın Sanem Dikmen'i, İHKİP Yönetim Kurulu üyesi Sayın Cem Altan'ı, İTİP Yönetim Kurulu üyesi Sayın Ahmet Şişman'ı, TÜTSİS Yönetim Kurulu üyesi Sayın Harun Tavaşi'yi, EURATEX Başkan Yardımcısı Sayın Ruşen Çetin'i sahneye takdim ediyorum. Hediye takdimimiz olacak. Moderatörümüz Dirk Vantyghem ve panelistlerimiz Bekke, Hughes, Bartosz Przywara ve Kamphöner'e hediye seremonisi olacak. Now we will have the gift ceremony. hediyelerimizi takdim ediyoruz ve ardından bir toplu fotoğraf çekimi olacak. Hangisi?